Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, I want to take a brief look at some crazy things that are unfolding in Turkey. Well, just the past couple weeks, if you've been following the news, you've seen that the prime minister, his name was Ahmet Davutoglu, that he has been removed from office. Now, this is huge news. If you follow what's going on in Turkey, this is huge news because the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is consolidating his power, his absolute autocratic power, his dictatorship over this nation. And so what's unfolding in Turkey right now is incredible. So Davutoglu, well, he was basically the architect. He was this college professor that wrote a book called Strategic Depth, where he really laid out the game plan, the blueprint for the present Islamist party in Turkey, the AKP party, to rise to power. And President Erdogan, he rose to power side by side with Davutoglu, eventually putting him into the seat of the prime minister as the premier. Well, apparently Davutoglu was not obedient enough to Erdogan, and as a result, he has been forced out, and we will now have sort of a puppet premier who will replace him. But listen to this headline. As Davutoglu exits, Erdoganists, they're the ones who are following the current president Erdogan, they demand obedience to the leader. Please listen to this. The concept of a leader and absolute obedience to this leader exists in our faith and in our state tradition. What is being said here? Within Islamic theology, when a caliph comes into a power, a khalifa, the caliph is sort of the pope, president, and general of the Islamic world. He's essentially the religious, military, and political leader, all wrapped up into one head, into one office. And when a caliph comes into office, as we just saw with ISIS, all of the Muslims are obligated to make the pledge. It's called the bay'ah. It's the pledge of allegiance to the caliph. And so we've seen different Islamist groups all over the Islamic world, all the way from Northern Africa, all the way over to Pakistan, making the pledge, these various jihadists making the bay'ah pledge. They pledge their life, complete obedience to the caliph. And so long as he obeys and implements Sharia, the Islamic law, all Muslims are, according to that law, obligated to follow him and serve him. So that's the theological basis for subservience to the caliph in Islam, but even more so in Turkey, where Turkey eventually assumed the headship of the caliphate, the Islamic government. The Ottoman Empire was really the Ottoman Caliphate. The sultans, they became the new caliphs. And so the office of sultan and caliph, they're essentially one and the same. Sultan is basically a Turkish caliph, the head of the Ottoman Empire. And so subservience to the sultan, subservience to the caliph is one and the same. So here you have a mayor in the nation of Turkey saying absolute obedience to Erdogan is mandatory, not just for those who support him, but for all Turks and all Muslims. Folks, what is happening in Turkey? If you're to listen to a lot of the various Bible prophecy teachers out there, they'll say, Joel, we don't really need to be paying attention to Turkey. The real locus of satanic power, the real place that we really need to be paying attention to, the real place that Ezekiel was talking about, that's Russia. And you've had some guys that have come pretty much out and said that Putin is Gog. I mean, they've basically all but inferred it. And I'm not saying that Erdogan is Gog. But what I'm saying is we do need to be paying attention to Turkey because it's out of Turkey. It's out of this culture, this society, this geography, this region that I believe we will see the emergence of the Antichrist. And again, I'm not saying that Erdogan is the Antichrist, But if he's not, I mean, anyone could, he is certainly emerging as a clear foreshadow of the Antichrist. And even if you don't believe in Bible prophecy, we need to be paying attention to what's happening in Turkey because the geopolitical ramifications are dramatic. But back to the Bible prophecy teachers, what these guys are saying is, no, Joel, you have it all wrong because you have misinterpreted the names. You've misunderstood the names in Ezekiel's prophecy. Now listen, and if you have not read my book, Mideast Beast, please get it. If you're interested in biblical prophecy, please get my book. I'll go ahead and put a special up on my website where you can get the book and a DVD with it, where I have a few sessions where I teach on Gog, Magog. I've got 3 chapters in Mideast Beast where I deal with this in depth. I mean, painstaking detail. Make it very clear that Ezekiel is simply talking about the Antichrist, that Gog is the Antichrist, and that the Antichrist clearly comes out of the region of Greater Turkey. So I'd encourage you to get those things. But if you haven't read those things, then please hear me, because essentially what I am when I do this, I'm almost like the guy who's a magician who then comes out and makes a DVD where he exposes all of the other magicians. Because quite often, if you're just a student of Bible prophecy, it's kind of like reading all of these prophecy teachers who are working through all of the commentaries and the Bible dictionaries and the atlases and all of the historical resources. It's almost like magic because you sort of just have to put your faith that in what they're saying is true. Unfortunately, what a lot of the guys do is they just sort of parrot or imitate or follow the teachers before them. So in the same way that a lot of people's views of what Ezekiel is being said is just formed by having read their favorite teacher, and listen, this is understandable, everyone does this, many of the teachers themselves do the same thing. And this is the problem, is we need to be Bereans. We need to be careful students of history and the scriptures. Listen, if Paul the Apostle, if he praised the Bereans because they checked out what he said, then how much more should we check out what we read in some popular prophecy teachers' books, right? So there are 2 methods. Here comes the opening up the magic. Here's how it's done so that you yourself can do the magic. There's really 2 methods of interpretation. The first one is this sort of bloodline lineage migration method. I call it the historical wild goose chase. So what that means is this. You've got the various names that Ezekiel lists. You've got Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah. You've got Persia, Cush, and Put. You've got all these different names. Well, what do they mean? How do we understand what Ezekiel was saying? Well, the first method that some people use is this historical wild goose chase. So let's say we're dealing with Gomer. Well, what they try to do is trace the Gomerite peoples. Who did Gomer become? What tribes did they become? Who did they intermarry with? Where did they live? Where did they migrate? Where did they move? And you're essentially trying to trace the DNA, the bloodline of the ancient biblical Gomerite peoples down through history. I mean, a couple thousand years. I mean, actually 4,000 or 5,000 years trying to identify them. And then we become subject to the very limited resources that we have, the limited historical resources, the various ancient historians, and this sort of thing. And there becomes all sorts of debatable material. I mean, obviously, there's much to be debated here. And we lose parts of history because we don't have just a sort of, comprehensive history of the world. We can try to piece it together. We can look at various ancient sources, but it almost becomes a little bit hopeless. At the best we have is guesswork. Now, the other problem with this is that when we look at the various peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy and we trace them down, we end up with pretty much the whole world because the peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy eventually came to be dispersed all over the world. Okay, so I would argue that this whole wild goose chase method is a bad method. It's a bad method. We're not trying to trace DNA and bloodline. Instead, what we should be using is the standard evangelical approach to interpreting Scripture, which is the historical grammatical method or the grammatical historical method, which is to say that we are studying and working through the actual grammar, the language of the text, as well as the historical context. And so what this translates to is we try to understand how did Ezekiel and his New Guinea. And so someone comes along a couple thousand years and they go, well, where did the Americans live? And someone could easily say, well, Americans lived all over the world. Yes, Americans are dispersed all over the world, just like many of the peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy were scattered. But on the other hand, anyone in our day would still understand that even though there's Americans all over the world, it's the United States that is the home of the Americans. And so when it says the Americans, it's pointing to the United States. It's not pointing to the entire world. So we're not trying to find every little part of the world where any of these peoples, a couple tribes could have lived. We're trying to understand the names as they would have been understood by Ezekiel. Okay. Now, the other issue, though, is, but where did they primarily live in Ezekiel's day? So those are really the two factors that we need to be sort of trying to understand. Now, all of that said, I just received a book in the mail just a couple days ago called Mistaken Identity: The Case Against the Islamic Antichrist by S. Douglas Woodward. Now, Doug is an acquaintance. Can't say we're great friends, but I've begun to get to know Doug. We actually did 3 radio programs together just recently where we had sort of a friendly fireside chat. Now, this was hosted by Southwest radio host Larry Sparmagino. And they were very enjoyable programs. And if you're a Bible prophecy guy, I'll put up the links. You can watch these shows. They'll be airing. We filmed them as well as got the audio. But we had just a real friendly discussion about this issue of, could the Antichrist come from the Middle East? Or is he going to be this popularly understood revived Roman European leader? So this was an enjoyable show, but it was just after the show that I actually got the book, Mistaken Identity. So what I want to do is I want to work through some of the material that's in here, because I have, over the years, I've looked at and written articles and tried to share with you all dozens upon dozens of examples of scholarly references that point over and over and over again to Turkey as the head, as the leader of the coming Ezekiel invasion. So the first map I just want to look at before we jump into Doug's book is a map that comes from the IVP Atlas of Bible History. So again, I've got a big old stack of Bible atlases, but this is a great one, one that I would definitely recommend. So what does the IVP Atlas of Bible History say? Well, if we look at the map, it says that Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah are all in modern-day Turkey. So how would Ezekiel have understood these names? Again, he would have looked to the region of Asia Minor, the region that today we refer to as Turkey. Well, what's the second resource? Well, then we've got the New Moody Atlas of the Bible, another fantastic resource. If you want to just grab yourself a few Bible atlases, this is one that I would definitely recommend. Again, where does the New Moody Atlas of the Bible place Magog, Meshech, Tubal, all of these names? Once again, clearly in Asia Minor in Turkey. What about the Holman Bible Atlas? Another great resource, highly recommend.